All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to this episode or this version of the Graybeard Talks Geospatial. I'm live today with my friend Matt Sheehan, and I need to get Matt to unmute his mic so that he can go ahead and talk to us.
How's that?
Hey Matt, good to see you today. Thanks for joining me.
Good to see you.
This is your first time on the Graybeard Talks Geospatial, right?
The famous piece of it.
The famous, yeah. I'll take that. Listen, I'm really excited to have this conversation today with Matt. Those of you who know Matt, you know he's a principal at WhyofThere. He's a geospatial thinker that has quite a reputation for his philosophical look at the world of geospatial. And so it's really exciting to have him on, and we can have I think, a lively and wide-ranging discussion today. I want to thank everybody who's on so far. We've got a few people on. And this is going to be a perfect episode if you're here today watching. It's going to be a perfect episode to ask questions, because there should be quite a bit of provocative information here that could spur comments, and we're both looking forward to having your interaction. So you could start maybe by putting it in the comments where you're watching from. That'll give us a sense of who we're talking to. Matt, before we get started with our conversation, I want to read something. I have promised over the past couple of episodes to start sharing with the different viewers what I'm reading, something from what I'm reading. And so I wanted to share today that I'm rereading the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I try and do that regularly, like once a year or something like that, because of all things I need to be more effective, and I know that's the case. But I want to read a paragraph from the chapter of Habit 4, Think Win-Win. If you've never been exposed to this concept before, you should dig into this book and listen to this. I have it on audiobook, and I also have a bunch of books, but you should think about reading this book by Steve Covey. So this is in the chapter called Win-Win. Okay, win-win is a frame of mind and heart that constantly seeks mutual benefit in all human interactions. Win-win means that agreements or solutions are mutually beneficial, mutually satisfying. With a win-win solution, all parties feel good about the decision and feel committed to the action plan. Win-win sees life as a cooperative, not a competitive arena. Most people tend to think in terms of dichotomies: strong or weak, hardball or softball, win or lose. But that kind of thinking is fundamentally flawed. It's based on power and position rather than on principle. Win-win is based on the paradigm that there is plenty for everybody, that one person's success is not achieved at the expense or exclusion of the success of others. And I wanted to read that because I think fundamentally, as we go on and as we try and add value to each other and to the industry that we're working in, it's important that we see our role as additive and cumulative rather than competitive in nature. Have you heard of that concept before, win-win? Matt?
Yeah. Stephen Covey's actually was from Salt Lake. In fact, I had meals multiple times and saw him, so I know his work quite well.
You get up and down the canyons a lot, and if you know anything about Steve Covey, you know that what killed Steve Covey, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. He was in a bicycle accident. He was a road biker. He was in a bicycle accident, and eventually he had an infection as part of the treatment that took his life. But my brother used to date his daughter way back in the old days. When I grew up in Bountiful, Utah, and that's where they were from, in that area. Anyway, so Matt, maybe you could just take a minute, introduce yourself. I know you live in Salt Lake City. Your accent probably really indicates that you're not from there originally. So maybe give the folks who are listening just a quick background on where you're from, what you do, and where you live now, and all that.
My American accent's terrible. My kids always used to say to me, "Dad, put on your American accent." I could never roll my R. Car. It was always sort of never worked. So I've still got a strong accent. I came in the 90s. I did a physical geography in London University. Came here to ski, basically. That's how I ended up in Utah, get away from books. met my wife, came back here in 91, a graduate degree in GIS, the University of Utah in the mid-90s, and have pretty much spent my career within the geospatial world, GIS primarily, and we'll talk about some of this stuff. Half of my time really on the technical side of the GIS world, and then half of my time on the business side. So I've sort of spanned both worlds. And I kind of, people that read the things I write, you'll probably get the sense. I think, Bruce, you're similar to me. I always try and look at things from the top down. So again, as a geographer, start with the big picture. A lot of my career has been spent with a lot of detail. Not enough maybe with some of those bigger picture thinkers, but I always try and see the big picture pieces before the details. And some of the stuff we'll talk through here actually is some drill down stuff from the top into some details. So, but not too much detail. That's
good. Just briefly though, tell me, you started out working, I think, at a municipality back in the engineering department. Is that correct? Or were you?
I did my graduate degree. I wrote and again, I'll talk about that. I wrote a web application, a GIS web application in the 90s, and the US Forest Service picked up on what I was doing. So they actually paid me to do the work, which was nice because as a poor graduate student, they paid for the work, which was great. And we released it actually within the Forest Service, probably one of the earliest web GIS apps that was released in the Forest Service. And I then went to work for the Forest Service. So my first role was actually within the US Forest Service.
Okay, excellent. So you got a good technical background, and since then you've been on the business side and done a lot of interesting things. I think that those of you who followed Matt know that he's kind of the face of what we would call Geospatial 2.0. And so we're going to have a discussion. We're going to start with that topic of where we are and exactly what is Geospatial 2.0. And if there is a Geospatial 2.0 idea, then there must be Geospatial 1.0, but we never talk about that. So let's just start with, you did a video recently that's been on LinkedIn that talks about the history of geospatials, and it's a 15-minute video. It's a tour de force, starting at the beginning and going to the end. But I asked if you would give us just a 3 to 5 minute synopsis of what is geospatial, where did it come from, and where are we today?
Yeah, I think that to get context, if we talk about 2.0, we have to look backwards. So where have we been? And I'm actually going to hit a timer here because Bruce, that I can talk. I'm helping myself to accountability.
I wasn't going to call you out. But you and I have been on the phone and on Zoom meetings enough for me to know that I have to have a signal. I got to go like this or something to say, Matt, give me a minute. And you're on your computer audio, which fades back and forth if we're talking over each other. So we got to really pay attention. When I do this, and you're saying, "Oh, I got to slow down. I got to stop a little bit and give Bruce a chance to chime in." But for now, we're good. You go right ahead.
Okay, good. So let's rattle through. So I'm actually gonna rattle through. Let's see, 50 years in 5 minutes or so. And I've actually got a short write-up next to me, so I'm gonna kind of look at that a little bit. So let's go back to the 60s. Roger Tomlinson, we all know about, British geographer. Worked in Canada. He was kind of the father of GIS. Jack Dangerman, I believe, knew him and his work. He also worked in the space. He wasn't a geographer. Started Esri in '69. Jump to the 80s. The 70s was really the development of the technology, which was then called GIS, Geographic Information Systems. 1982, ArcInfo was released. I remember it well. 1985. MapInfo was released by a rival to Esri. Intergraph Geomedia was in there as well. So we had this period in the early 80s, which is sort of, I want to call it the dumb terminals period, because I remember ArcInfo was a dumb terminal. Everything was done on the server. We all logged into it and we did our work there. So that was the start. That was really the start of GIS. It was really, and I'll summarize, in my view, it was map making. I'm not sure as you would necessarily agree with me calling it map making, but in large part, people use it for making maps. It was points, lines, and polygons. And us that did it and we studied it, you'll probably remember the pains of learning about these points, lines, and polygons.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you that it's map making, but I think that GIS is characterized by attribute. data, right? Attribution is really important in GIS. It's not just where it is, but it's also what are the associated attributes, and that kind of sets it apart from being a dumb map.
Yeah,
more than a dumb map.
Visualization's a better term, but I mean, I suppose what I wanted to differentiate was analytics is over here, map and the attributes attached to a feature is over here. So maybe visualization with attached attributes is a better way of saying it than map making.
Yeah.
It was when I was introduced to GIS, I was never a cartographer, I was a geographer. And I started dealing with maps all the time, which was like, whoa, hang on, but I'm a geographer. And some geographers believe that they're map people. I was never a map person. I was a studier of what was happening in a particular location. Why the pioneers settled in Salt Lake City, human geography. Why Little Cottonwood Canyon is a U-shaped valley. What are the processes? So that was my world. But so keep moving because I'm already 2.5 minutes in.
Yeah, keep going.
The 90s is summarized by desktop GIS, the internet, and Esri becoming the 800-pound gorilla in the space. So again, let's walk through 1995, ArcView. I remember I was a graduate student then when ArcView came out. Wonderful. I loved ArcView. It was lovely GUI, relatively easy to use if you trained on it, but I liked it. It was not. ArcInfo was great, but ArcInfo was a bear. ArcView was a pleasure, so I enjoyed ArcView. 1996, Map Objects IMS. That was my graduate degree. I wrote an application, Visual Basic in Map Objects IMS. That was Esri's first foray into the world of the internet. So, and now we talk about the internet. I saw the internet in 1991. The University of Utah was on the circuit of those universities, and there weren't very many that were on the internet. So I saw it early, and I thought, oh my gosh, this thing is going to change our world, and it did do. Map Object IMS was the first Esri product. I can't talk about the competitors of Esri because I didn't know much about them, and I'll talk about that in a second. But notable then was MapQuest. MapQuest, a lot of people have kind of forgotten MapQuest. They were the first popular, consumer-centric, but map-based product on the market. And that was, I forget when they were launched, they were in the 90s. Most people forget that, but they were important, MapQuest. I have to mention MapServer as well. MapServer came out about that time. Brilliant open source technology, still going, still great. Let's talk about marketing. And we're 4 minutes in. I'm trying to move quickly.
Yeah.
Esri, why did Esri become the 800-pound gorilla in the space? They became the 800-pound gorilla in the space because they were so smart. Jack and the team at the top were so smart about how their business model and their marketing. How did they become so successful? One of the key ones was they gave their software to universities. When I went and did my graduate degree, I only knew Esri technology. I did not know ArcInfo. I had no idea that Intergraph GeoMedia was probably the dominant GIS technology on the market. Is sort of in that 90s period. You know, I only learned that by working at the company. I was telling guys were telling me, didn't you know about that? And then I was like, no. Well, why didn't I know about that? Because I only knew Esri. I was taught Esri because it was
right.
At university. When I left, where did I go? I went into the public sector. And what did I apply? Esri GIS. And so the history of sort of why Esri became the 800-pound gorilla has its roots, to some degree, in that they gave it to people like me who were trained to use the stuff, and then we applied it. And I'll underline that, public sector infrastructure. We went into departments and became that place. Those people that have tried to compete with Esri, some of those that used to compete have fallen away. I'm not sure they would like me saying that, but they have. And those that have tried to compete with Esri, the Boundlesses, CartoDB originally came out and were pointing at Esri. They really haven't been particularly successful. Boundless has become part of Planet, didn't really succeed. So Esri are the dominant player in the GIS space, without any exception.
Right, now let's use this as a jumping off point, because you and I talked yesterday about the concept that if there is such a thing as Geospatial 2.0, then there has to be, by definition, there has to be Geospatial 1.0. And so I think based on what we talked about, and I have to admit, before last night when Matt and I started preparing for this session, I think my understanding of Geospatial 2.0 was just a little off kilter. And so let's just take a step and say it. Let's just talk about Geospatial 1.0. I think the Esri approach to the market, not necessarily to the technology, but to the market, is a Geospatial 1.0 approach, right? Fixed assets, more public sector based in their approach. Is that am I hearing you right when you say that's what Geospatial 1.0 is?
Yeah, I think so. I think let me summarize it in a minute, Bruce. There are definitely some things, and I think for those that have read some of the things I've sort of pointed out in terms of 1.0, 2.0, these are just sort of categorizations, if you like. They're not like you're in this bucket or in this bucket. There's flexibility. Right. It isn't like it sounds like 2 replaces 1, and you'll hear from it really doesn't.
Right.
There is something very defining about 1.0 and something very defining about 2.0. But let me rattle on just a second more on historical stuff, and then let me summarize it, because I think some of this, it'll become clearer as we sort of talk through things. So let's jump into the 2000s. I think what the 2000s are characterized by is what I would say is recreating desktop technology on the web, and Google Maps, and the evolution of mobile. So let's go through dates. 2000 Arc IMS came out, which was a huge jump on Map Objects IMS, and it was great technology. I did a lot of work with Arc IMS. 2001 GeoServer came out, which was an open source kind of version of Map Server, not version of Map Server, they quite technology. It was a brilliant, it remains a brilliant technology. So that was 2001. But what really blew the market open was in 2005, Google Maps appeared. And Google Maps was a huge shock to the GIS industry, not just to Esri, to the whole industry, because all of a sudden you had access to A, something that was really easy to use, B, it was filled with data. So it was a totally different experience. It wasn't this expert tool anymore. It was this consumer accessible interactive mapping system. It was amazing. And I always talk about slippy maps. People say, what's a slippy map? And I don't think Google came out with slippy maps. I think it was OpenStreetMap. I think. Someone can correct me on that. But slippy maps is when you used Arc IMS, and folks on the call that remember Arc IMS will remember this. If you panned or you zoomed the map, it sent a request to the server, and the server came back with a new picture. What did that mean from a user's perspective? It flashed. It flashed. And when you first saw Arc IMS, when I was first building apps in Arc IMS, I was like, this is okay. At least I'm getting now a new zoom in or a pan. I'm getting a new picture. As soon as you saw Google Maps, and it was a seamless experience where a tile came in, and it was this zoomed in, it was this continual experience. That was the end of an Arc IMS type experience. So Google Maps was a massive, massive advance in terms of sort of usability on the web. And it shocked the Esri and all the GIS industry, and they had to catch up. And they did very successfully. I think one of the great fears then was Google then were threatening to get into the enterprise space. So Google was suggesting then that they were going to become a competitor to Esri and the other people in the GIS space, which was very scary for the industry. In the end, they decided, well, they were a consumer company and we're an ad company as well, so we're moving away from that. So they never went down that path. So we kind of got to that place where that was a huge jump for web GIS. Desktop was still highly relevant, and most of us were still working desktop, but that was a big thing on the web. 2010, the iPad 1 came out. First extreme mobile computer that had GPS built in. Started the mobile revolution. That mobile revolution was, I started Web Map Solutions actually about that time. I expected it to be much more quickly adopted the enterprise space, but as it turned out, the consumers drove that, and all the geospatial stuff that came out was attached to consumer-centric apps. So you read about how many of these apps are being released that have got either GPS or some kind of locational component to them, and it was like ridiculous numbers, 75% or something. On the GIS side and the geospatial side, a lot of it was about field data collection, and apps came out then that were still very popular now that were really about going in the field and collecting data directly on an electronic device and dumping it. There's the 2000s. You were gonna jump in, Bruce.
No, I'm not going to. I just think I would, that history is just so big and broad and compelling to talk through. We get in through the 2000s, and we are where we are today. And I want to go back to the idea of Geospatial 2.0, because I think it's such a big part of what people know you by, right? And I want to make sure that when people leave this live stream today, that one of the pieces of information that they can go away with is clearly defining in their mind what you mean when you say Geospatial 2.0. Because, like I said, I think I had it wrong to begin with. Okay, so let's read a couple comments here quickly just to kind of get through. I think that we've got Steve and Mike and Tiffany and James and Nicholas. Thank you all for coming today. We appreciate you coming. Tiffany, lots of good stuff here. Tiffany, she says Web 2.0 brought on that social element or approach. Will Geospatial 2.0 surpass that to the next? Calling all AI. You know, when you put in comments, Tiffany, they're so colloquial, so modern. Sometimes I miss everything. So thanks for being so current. But can you any comments there, Matt?
Web 2.0. Yeah, I think it will. Let me define 2.0. So I'll get back to this question. So to your question, I went 11 minutes long, so I apologies about that. Doubled up. Forgot my watch.
That's okay.
Geospatial 1.0, GIS is the dominant technology within that space. It's really characterized by it's public sector and infrastructure focused. So it's that niche that we often talk about. It's really expert technology. We've never moved away from that. It was people like me and you who work on that. We were trained how to use it. It was sold into It is sold into mapping and GIS departments to people like you and I. We are the buyer personas for that because we get it. So the language and the marketing and the sales is on us. That's exactly why it's been so successful, because we get it and we've implemented it in the public sector and in infrastructure and utilities. It's dominated by live providers, and it's really centered on a technology stack which is two-dimensional in large part because this is all the data we had, points, lines, and polygons, focused on maps. And I will argue GIS now means Esri. Nothing against Esri, but it used to be an umbrella term that covered everyone that sat in the space. It no longer does that. If you do a Google search and you put in GIS, everything is pretty much Esri. So it really means Esri to me. I think
Esri would consider that viewpoint a real success, right? Yeah, I did this last night. You know, this is a Kleenex, right? No, it's a tissue, but Kleenex kind of covers it. And I think Esri would think that that's a success, that when you say GIS, I think people think Esri. So that being the case, I mean, I really appreciate your definition of what 1.0 is. So what characterizes 2.0 from 1.0? What's the main character difference between those two approaches to geospatial?
Yeah. So I think, and the timeline, I'll rattle on the timeline, but 2015, let's start at 2015. In 2015, we saw Esri rebrand. We saw Esri become a science of where. So they started to change their messaging. They moved away from maps to change their messaging. And I think that's as they started to get GIS out of the mapping department. And you'll see Adam Carno do some great pieces on, let's get it across the organization. So the 1.0 world is continuing to grow and continue to be successful. It hasn't stopped and isn't about to be replaced anytime soon. It's got a very bright future. But what happened in 2015 is quite notable. Two things happened really, and they didn't happen overnight. I'm using kind of 2015 as kind of somewhat of an arbitrary date. Two things happened. We got miniaturized sensors, which meant we could send satellites up into space that were tiny, and they could take really high resolution imagery of the ground. We could stick in aeroplanes, LiDAR, SAR is also, radar also in space. We could put things on drones. We could drive down roads and collect LiDAR. We can go in buildings. We've got IoT. So we got this flood of data. And I kept hearing, oh my gosh, we've got this tsunami of data. We've got too much data. Well, gosh, go back to 2000 and 2001, 2003. We had no data. I mean, you remember that, Bruce. You couldn't get any data. You couldn't get base maps. You couldn't get any overlays. So it was tough. So that's been a huge change, and that's been really quite recent. If you look at the space industry, companies like they've only been around for a little while. They do SAR, they do radar from space. They can punch through clouds and look at the ground. The other thing that's happened is AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning, which goes back to the question. So why is that a big deal? When you've got tons and tons of data, we as humans can't process that data. We can't process it, we can't analyze it. So AI's come in and has now started to do that work. So we're at that stage where we have floods of data and we have artificial intelligence and machine learning to process that data. That's at the heart of Geospatial 2.0. None of the 1.0 technologies were built for what's just happened.
So you know what? I didn't catch that last night when we were talking about it, but I want to make sure and just grab onto that thought just a minute. You know, big data has been a problem for a long time. It's been a problem for several years, and I think what you're asserting there is that that AI has fundamentally changed the way that we're going to deal with big data from here on out. Is that true?
Yeah, and most of that big data is location-based data. So we're now, and the other part to that, again, which the 1.0 world was not originally built for, is real-time data. So and when you hear about digital reality and all digital twins, all this good stuff, well, that's sort of three-dimensional data. Two-dimensional data is really what we've lived with as trained geographers and people that use GIS. It's brilliant for patterns. Show me patterns. Dump a load of data on a map, and I can see those patterns. That's what it's really good for. Three-dimensional data is really good for sense of place. Drop me on that intersection. Let me see what it actually looks like, you know, in a digital world. But alone, they're not that. I mean, I think it's how you tell data stories is using 2 dimensions on its own is good. If you combine it with 3 dimensions, there's a place for telling a story there. And I come to the website, I tell a story about some collision work that I did a while ago, taking from a two-dimensional, where are the collisions, to a 3-dimensional, what does that intersection look like with those really bad collisions? Let me start doing some diagnostics about what caused it. But the third piece of that is the 4th dimension, which is real-time data, because we live in a world that's always changing. So those data sets we're talking about, which define 2.0, are 2D, 3D, and 4D aggregated, and artificial intelligence pulling out data. I sometimes call it, you know, finding a needle in a haystack. I've got a question that needs an answer. What are the right data sets for me to use that AI can find for me and narrow down the choice that me as an analyst can go, well, you know, too much data, have no idea where to look. AI can say, there's 3 choices based on your question. You now use your brain to do that work. So AI doesn't replace our brains, because at some point, an expert, people listening on this call, have to make some decision based on what that AI is given back to us.
Yeah, let me read this comment from Tiffany. She says Geospatial 2.0 will involve the next layers of our analysis and senses. Big data isn't about size, but layers. I like that. I like that thought.
Yeah, I like that as well. As well.
And I want to also read this one from Steve. Steve, thanks for being on. He's pushing us into GIS 3.0. I guess we could say Geospatial 3.0 if we're trying to be correct here. Confluence of mobile, web, UI, and GIS 1.0 and 2.0. And I don't know. We're going to have to give some thought to that, Steve. But maybe that's the way you can look at it.
Yeah, I'll maybe I'll help with that as we sort of step through this, because I think that, I mean, you get the sense of what it is. It's not some new technology stack. It's an emergence of a new capabilities that GIS wasn't designed for. And again, I think that when one talks about, so when I started a year or so ago, when I started diving into this, and I spent tons of my time talking across the world to different groups who know nothing about GIS, or they might know it vaguely. They're the 2.0 crowd, and they're all focused in so many different places. So it's a very fragmented market that's really, there's so many startups in it, and they're all over the world. I mean, India's a powerhouse in this stuff, but it's all over the place. I talk to people internationally. I'm not just talking in America and in Europe about this stuff. And I think what's really defining about this is we're suddenly getting this tech stuff spoken about, GovTech. I would argue that GIS, well, anything that sits under the 1.0 umbrella is more of a GovTech-centric they're answering GovTech questions. People in the public sector, federal, military, the questions they're answering are really in that space. So the technology is used to answer those kind of GovTech questions. But then if you start looking at outside of where GIS has its stronghold, in insurance, in finance, in agriculture, in retail, well, there is a small 1.0 presence there, but really not much. It's not really made any dent there. And I think that's why we call it the 1.0 world, more of a sort of it's a niche. But these new guys are going after all of these new techs. So insurtech, agtech, fintech, you got all these, they're all after those marketplaces. And the kind of things they're going after is climate change, sustainability. They're helping traders understand if a crop is going to fail this year by using satellite data, soil moisture, and all these clever things that you can do now. So, there's a whole load of guys out there in the 2.0 space that have known nothing about GIS. I mean, if you say, what's the OGC? They've never heard of the OGC. They need to know about the OGC. It's an important another topic, but they need to know about the OGC because some of them are reinventing the wheel, and we've already done it in the 1.0 world. So it's an emerging space. But what I wanted to underline was, and Ezra got out with the ArcGIS platform today, which is a platform as a service, and they're advancing, but they're really serving their customer base. I mean, in my view, and again, this is just my view, they're going to apply 2.0 technology to solve problems that utilities have got. Let's think about one that's happened this year. Tons of hurricanes have come through the south. The utilities in the South of America have really been struggling. They've lost facilities. They've got flooding's been a problem. Lines have been blown down. That's a real-time problem. How can those guys react in a more real-time way to something that's a location-based problem? Location data and location technology is at the core of that. That's a two-point question that can be answered. You can't have a static map that shows you where your power stations are when a hurricane's barreling down on you. You've got to have some real-time stuff that's there. I think that Esri are evolving into adding 2.0 pieces to their platform to answer those questions that sit in the space that they dominate, which is the GovTech utility infrastructure space. The other guys are in the commercial world, and they're trying to answer different questions.
We talked last night about maybe the idea of that the problems being solved in the 2.0 world were just much more dynamic in nature, right? They're not as static in the way that they approach the problems. The problems and the solutions were both very dynamic, and you can see from the examples you use, say climate change or agriculture, things like that, where everything's always moving and changing. Your assets aren't fixed. Your assets are all over the place. The data is huge. The data comes from all different data sources. And so I see, like you do, I see that the traditional 1.0 market will be kind of blending the two and solving 2.0 problems same way.
And I think let's look two good examples. The healthcare, the COVID pandemic. It's a dynamic changing thing. People are moving around that have got COVID. We're being able to trace those people, track who they've touched. That's really a 2.0 question. We're bringing sensor data from phones. That's a 2.0 question. So I love the dashboard that Esri put together. It's wonderful. It's a 1.0 dashboard, but the 2.0 stuff is where we're actually tracking where people are and could actually do that work with more dynamic data. I think the wildfires is another one. Again, I saw static maps which showed you this is where the fire is. And I looked at the data, well, it was 24 hours old. And that's great to get a reference point, but that's a 1.0 perspective. A real-time perspective is the fire just shifted, the wind just shifted 5 minutes ago, and that town that it's now heading towards is a big problem. It's a 2.0 question.
Yeah, and that's a really good, that would be a really good distinction. Let's just think of the difference between maintenance records for a water valve and understanding what a fire is going to do in the next 12 hours. Yeah. I mean, they're fundamentally location based in what's important to actually making those things have some business value to them. But they're fundamentally different in that one is very static and one location based, and the other is just very dynamic and changing all the time. And that's that 2.0 that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think the big thing there is we're talking about big data as well. We're talking about the aggregation of dynamic and static data, and then the processing of the data by AI to then answer a question, or at least cut down on the options of choices that you've got. Because I have to underline, I mean, AI is just a task-based thing that can find stuff that we can't find. But at the end of the day, there's no time soon that AI is going to make the decision. An analyst, an expert, a geospatial expert is going to make those final decisions. You know, these are our choices. What do we do? So I think it's all about decision making, faster decision making, and more confident about taking based on those combined data sets. Now, I don't think you'd say that GIS or the Geospatial 1.0 world is really about that. It's more about where are my assets. You know, it's more about context and the sort of a frame, patterns, and all those things. But it's more a historical sort of aspect to it, because again, it's answering those particular questions that what utility might have. But then when it comes to dynamic stuff, then we start talking 2.0, big data sets, and trying to put data sets quickly.
Right. You know, one of the questions we talked about this last night again as we were preparing for this. One of the questions is, you know, I describe you as a futurist. I think in my mind, you're a geospatial futurist, because a lot of your orientation is towards where is this all going, you know? And so one of the questions I have for you is, what do you think AI does to the traditional way that professionals are employed? You know, I mean, what does the job market look like for geospatial professionals with AI in the mix?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Bruce. I'll point people to AI superpowers. We spoke about this yesterday. There's a AI guy who's written a really interesting book, and he's done some projections on what he thinks about the job market. And his point is, it's quite interesting. He actually has a couple of pages where he said, these are the jobs under threat. These are the jobs that are okay. Those jobs, like a physical therapist, like a hairdresser, they're completely safe. They're not going to be impacted by AI. But a radiologist, and actually there's loads of doctors whose jobs are under threat. So let's talk about people that process data and create maps. Your job's under threat. AI is going to process a lot of that data. In fact, Sean Gorman, I'll point people at Sean Gorman, who used to work for Esri. He's doing some fantastic work with AI and generating 3D models from images. It's amazing. So he's creating all this stuff automatically. So that part of the world's changing. And I think also from an analytical perspective, you're going to need fewer analysts. And we were talking about this yesterday. There's still a huge demand for sort of geospatial GIS analysts. We're moving away from that world. Not completely. I mean, I think that idea that you go to college, and I think I wanted to point back at Arc News this month, actually, or this winter 20, which has come out, 2021. There's a couple of things in there that caught my attention. The first one is people are being trained in universities to think geospatially. Well, actually, they're not. I didn't agree with the girl's comments there. Most people are still being taught to be button pushers, and I don't mean to belittle that, because you have to learn things. Like when I learned ArcView, I learned the drop downs and the menus and how to do certain things. But that stuff over time is going to go away. I think, and we're talking quite a bit down the road, that's going to be automated. I think where we'll be most useful is when we start. And again, I think some of Adam's points are really good. Adam Carno's points is you got to start thinking about what comes into you and why are you answering this question? You know, what is the reason behind the question? Don't generate something without thinking about it. Ask the question, because I think where we fall down, and there's you asked me a little bit about me and one of the things that I do now within my WhyofThere is, or my company that I formed, is, you know, you've really got to kind of understand from a customer's perspective what they're trying to do. I mean, I think we've lived in a 1.0 world where the buyer persona was us. So the company spoke the language of GIS and the language of technology to us because we got it and we bought that stuff. Well, that world's changed. And I think when we're trying to get GIS out of the mapping department, we have to appeal to a new audience. And I think the fundamentally of what we do, my group do, is to try and present business outcomes rather than technology. I mean, it's super important. And I think that goes back to understanding the question. Why are you asking the question? And is, let's navigate from the problem to the solution. And I think a lot of times we tend to push the buttons just to knock out, without asking, why are we doing this? And that then, starts you to engage with the business. What value does geospatial data, what value does geospatial technology bring to the business? And I think that's where Esri's challenges are. And we work with 1.0 companies. Again, I'm not, 1.0 world is, how do we get this out of the mapping department? Who don't understand the value of this technology and don't really care about the technology, they care about the outcome. How do we bring that to them? And then in the 2.0 world, the same challenge. A lot of these guys are technologists. They don't know how to understand what customers want. If you're an insurance company, what are the pain points you've got that geospatial data and technology can bring to help you solve those things? It's not about the technology, it's about the conversation on the outcome, the business outcome. So back to your question, it's that I think is critical for us all to understand. Don't be a button pusher anymore. Ask those critical questions about what is the problem and understand that journey to the solution. And you're the expert. You're their guide to the solution.
Yeah, now this is I think an interesting point, because I think this is where my personal development, my love of that whole discipline of personal development comes in, because I love mindset. I love the idea. Now, if you have a mindset that's a fixed mindset, you're going to go into this next period of geospatial development in a time of crisis and lack, because your job is going to go away if you stay with the same old, right? But if you take Matt's advice, or if you kind of look at the AI world and say, well, where do I fit? Then you're going to be looking at geospatial thinking rather than geospatial doing or button pushing. I want to read this comment from Tiffany, because she says she's going to plug a book she's been reading. I think this is about what we're talking about here. Humans Are Humans by Jeff Colvin. And that's a great recommendation. I'm going to put that on my.
That's a good one.
I'm going to put that on. Thanks, Tiffany. So just I think that one of the things I want to just mention here, folks, I've tried to keep this down to 30 minutes usually, but I've said in the most recent weeks, I don't really care if you want to hang around. We're going to keep talking. But thanks for being here. And if you have somewhere to go, heaven's sakes, go there and come back and listen to the recording later. But I do want to ask Matt a couple more questions before we finish for the day, even though we're 47 minutes into it. And the first one really is, Matt, one of the things I like about your approach is that you focus on business outcomes, or on the type of outcomes that where one of the inputs, or at least one input, or maybe more than one input, is spatial in nature or location in nature. So what are the new types of value that are out there in the 2.0 world that we're just now scratching the surface of, that as we push more into the geospatial 2.0, what kinds of value can we find in these kinds of business outcomes where location is a factor?
Let me see if I'm going to interpret your question right, Bruce. I think my perspective is that our world is organized, our non-digital world is organized geographically. There's that old phrase, everything happens somewhere. So whether it's you're at work, at play, there is a geospatial aspect to everything you do. And geospatial stands for a place on Earth. So that's what its meaning is. Nobody really understands the term, and we should have another talk with people about how we change the location. Intelligence doesn't really work for you. Location analytics doesn't. GIS definitely doesn't. Geospatial doesn't. So who are we? What are we? But fundamentally, I think we organize ourselves in a geographic way. We're really moving that into the computer. So when you talk about 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions or real time, our world is 3 dimensions with movement and change. So we're really recreating our world in a computer. So why it's so fundamental to what the future holds is because our world is organized in a geographic, geospatial way. Everything has a place, or everything is linked to a place. So problem can't we solve using technology? That's the question. We can talk about climate change, sustainability. We can talk about some of the challenges that the insurance industry have got about making decisions about disasters that come through. We can talk about traders doing fast trades based on what they understand about something happening in a place. I mean, it's an endless stream of things that we can answer. I think one of the, and hopefully I'm answering this question because I think the value is immense. I think what's been bothered me for 25 years in the industry is, why are we in this little niche that is only being worked? It's the public sector that is leveraging this technology. In the US, federal, state, local government, utilities, infrastructure, transportation, are doing this kind of thing because they're inherently, there's kind of this obvious locational aspect to it, and we all work in those industries. So we tell people this is a locational question, but all the location questions are everywhere. I would challenge you to think about what is not location based. Talk about, the healthcare industry. All of a sudden, people realize, oh my gosh, there's a locational aspect to this. It happens that, I forget the guy's name, the cholera outbreak in London. That was like one of the first sort of geospatial analyses where they realized it came from a well in London. Snow, the guy whose name was Dr. Snow. If you haven't looked at it, go look that up. It's an interesting one. The retail industry is fundamentally geospatial. The banking industry, fundamentally geospatial. I could go on. So what we have to do is we have to demonstrate to these people who don't understand that they're fundamentally geospatial businesses how what we know about the data and the technology can be applied to solve problems. And the problems that we can help solve are endless.
Yeah, I agree. And do you think that the advances in 3D and in building GIS, do you think that's a fundamental shift in the way traditional commercial enterprises will experience the value of spatial?
I think that I have to tell you about off camera about a girl I'm chatting to who's just brilliant. She's more focused on spatial computing, which is virtual reality and those type of things. But in answer to your question, I think that it's interesting if you talk about GIS or Geospatial 1.0 being in the two-dimensional static world, and that's kind of overstating. I don't fully believe that, but that's sort of the history that 1.0 is really sort of inhabited. Then you talk about the 3D world, which was interesting to me. I hadn't really touched on that until a couple of years ago. That's the engineering world and CAD, and you see a lot of BIM stuff there. So you've got experts in the GIS experts in one place. You've got CAD and engineering experts over here, and then you get 3D dropped into sort of Google Earth. Well, 3D itself is, and Esri guy changed my perspective on 3D not quite a few years ago. 3D alone is just cool, isn't it? That's cool. I can see a ski resort that's in 3D or a building where I live 3D, great. But at the end of the day, you're asking, it's just a sort of a cool toy. What do I care? And I think we're still in that place where the wider adoption of 3D has yet to happen because we've never linked it to a problem. And I won't tell the story, but if you want to, I'll tell a story on my blog. There's a blog post I've got which talks about, I'll tell it incredibly briefly. Safety engineers in transportation departments are most focused on collisions. They want to cut down on the number of collisions. It's a huge thing. I mean, billions are being spent on this. And it started in Sweden with, I forgot what it's called now, something zero, Vision Zero. So their process of understanding this, where are all the collisions? So they use 2D maps to sphere all the collisions are. They can drill down and find out fatalities, etc. But what do they do next? They drive out to the site to see why is that particular intersection so problematic? Is it a low-hanging vegetation? Yada, yada, yada. They have to try and somehow diagnose the problem to solve it. There's a perfect place for 3D. So we built something actually a couple of years ago when I was not with WhyofThere, which kind of took them through a story of data. Now you've isolated where those collisions are, click on that map, and lo and behold, a three-dimensional map came up with, by the way, we actually included some LiDAR. It was all LiDAR data. We included actual collisions in the intersections. So they didn't have to drive out to where that intersection was. They could do all their work online in a 3D environment to try and do diagnosis. So there's the power of 3D. Now you can add, I'll leave you to do that.
Well, no, it's really funny.
Add 4D data, add movement data to that. That digs even deeper into that problem. So there's a story of data which isn't focused on 3D per se, and oh, look at this cool 3D. look. It's more about solving a problem. And that's, to me, that's how we bring out the value of this location-based data. Tell stories using that data that solve a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, I probably missed this because I have a simple mind sometimes, but it's really funny when you mention 3D and you talk about that example. So I think about that example, and that example is a 1.0 example, but since it's got 3D in it, it feels cool enough to be a 2.0 example. I mean, it's really a 1.0 example. It's fixed in location. It's got small enough data that you don't have to break the bank to process it. But it has 3D in it, so it's really cool. So maybe it's 2.0.
Maybe.
But then if you add movement to it, then all of a sudden fundamentally it becomes a 2.0 problem. It's something where there's a lot of data points and there has to be a lot of data crunching and you have to be really dynamic in your approach. So I just think it's pretty interesting. I love to think about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's good you raise these things, Bruce, because I mean, these are just sort of theoretical constructs in some ways. I mean, I think in my mind, talking 1.0 over here and 2.0 over here, even though they're very abstract, there isn't really like this dividing line. I think about the 1.0 world as our historical, where we've been. I think of 2.0 as this magical world that we're entering, all driven by technology. It's new data, it's AI, it's those things. So, I mean, the divide, to me, again, it's what questions are we trying to answer? And honestly, the technology stacks in the 2.0 world, a lot of those guys are building their own stacks and they're processing data in their own way. They're not sitting on top of a 1.0 platform, for example. So, some people are using Esri to do some of that stuff. Some people are using some of the other tech companies to do that stuff, but a lot of them are doing their own thing. So, it's really an evolving world. And I think one of the big things that I've had many conversations about this, and maybe this is a good way to sort of, certainly on my side, maybe close things out a little bit, is we're not involved in the 2.0 world. The 1.0 group, all of us that are probably watching this, all of the organizations that have been set up over the years, we still are focused in 1.0 land. And the 2.0 world is happening anyway. They're not really looking over their shoulder and going, oh, these guys have done this over here, we should have a look at this. They're really going their own way. And unless we're part of that world, unless we can inject ourselves into that world, it's going to happen without us. And that's going to be a blooming shame, because we as geospatial GIS experts bring enormous value to that world, but they don't care about us. And we need to put ourselves in there to have them say, tell us about that stuff that there are so many incredible things that are being built within the 1.0 world. These guys are reinventing it over here. We have to tell them, don't reinvent the wheel. We've done it here, and probably better than you're going to do it. So there has to be this bleeding over of what we know into that world. And I hope that when I write and share this stuff, and lots of people, AI people, read the stuff I write, the space hardware companies are reading it. So I hope that we sort of build that in a small sort of way, it opens up that conversation to say, there is a world over here that already exists. We should be talking and, to build community, because I think we are all one big community, really. And I think spatial thinkers, which we all are on this call, are hugely important in that world. And I talk a lot to tech guys that are building all this cool tech off of location data and AI, but they don't think like we think. We're trained to think in a certain way. They need our help.
That is so, Matt, this is so cool. This is where I wanted this to go in the end anyway. I wanted to get to this place. And so this is a good place. I'm glad you said that we could wrap it up here, because this is a good place to stop. Essentially what we're talking about is we're talking about spatial thinking. We're talking about taking spatial thinking into a non-spatial way of doing business. And that these constructs of Geospatial 1.0 and Geospatial 2.0, they're just a way of describing the gap that exists between those two worlds. In my mind, when I first started looking at Geospatial 2.0 and I started reading some of the things you wrote, I didn't catch that. For me, it was a kind of a competition. And that's why I read the win-win quote at the beginning, is because I want to get to this place where I say, okay, so this is a win-win, right? This is not an either or. This is, we have this approach and we have this way of looking at the world that is fundamentally spatial in nature. And this other part of the world is trying to solve problems that are bigger than we have solved already in our way of spatial thinking, but they can't really because they don't have a spatial way of thinking. So let's take our spatial way of thinking together with their big problems, and then we put those together and we get this thing called Geospatial 2.0, which is the, spatial thinking and the big problems and put them together. So that's an exciting understanding to finally for me to come to. And I appreciate you being patient with me to get me there. Anyway, you're a tremendously smart and interesting person, and I'm gonna have you on again because I think that we have a lot more to talk about, and I want to talk about what those problems are. I want to get deep into what those problems are that are begging to be solved by spatial thinkers and by spatial workflows, right, that we've already identified. And I love the thought you had that here they are out reinventing the wheel when we've got a lot of that wheel already created. And let's take the wheel and let's move it over there and figure out how to make that work for them.
Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. If you haven't read some of Matt's articles, what I would encourage you to do is to go onto Matt's LinkedIn profile and go to his article section. There's just several different articles he's written that are really enlightening and really helpful. And I think you'll see, like I do, why Matt is so important in this space, right? We're kind of pushing the envelope of what's possible and what's out there in the future in the geospatial world. Matt, any last thoughts before we go? I mean, I want to give you the floor for just one more minute if you want it. Anything that you want to throw out there for food for thought?
No, I think it's an ongoing conversation, and I think it behooves us as a community to start to drive the conversation. And I hope that it's good that what you just said there is music to my ears as well, Bruce, because maybe I haven't expressed it as well as I could have expressed it. But hopefully today's talk and those that are listening kind of understand that we have an enormous opportunity ahead of us, and I think, for me and for you and many others people I talk to, we're now going into the bigger world. We're not just in this smaller world. We're going into this bigger world, and there's work to be done to get there. It's going to be challenging, but we can help overcome those barriers. And I think just to finish on what you just said there, spatial thinking, us spatial thinkers, we are special. It's not the technology that's special. It's the way we think about those problems to solutions. We are unique and be able to do that, and that's our real value. And we have to make sure that people know that, and we have to bring that to that wider world. So the world, I think the future is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, I'm going to show Tiffany. She's going to have the last word. She says, "Big problems, big tools, big solutions on the way." That's a great way to describe it. And I want to just piggyback on what you just said. My family calls me the geospatial genius. Not because I'm an actual genius, it's just because relative to them, I'm a genius when it comes to where I am at any given time. But I think what you're saying is right, is that geospatial thinkers have this orientation in the world that has this fundamental basis in location that a lot of people don't have. Let's take that and use that and apply it wherever it can be applied and solve big problems. So yep. Thank you, Matt, and thanks to everybody who contributed to the conversation today. And please tell your friends in the geospatial world that the Graybeard is talking geospatial every Thursday afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern time. That's 1 p.m. Pacific time. We're going to have great guests from both within Critigen and outside of Critigen talking about, GIS and geospatial problems. And, one of the things I really like is how to integrate spatial data with traditional business problems. That's one of the things that I like to talk about an awful lot. So once again, thanks for coming, and I'll see you next Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern time. Matt, you're a gem. We're gonna talk again soon, okay?
Yeah, thank you, Bruce.
All right, ciao.
Bye-bye.